Today we'll be discussing the ACC Network Media Rights. My name is Anthony Barroso, and I'm a student of the Master's in Sports Administration program at St. Thomas. So just as important as the product on the field, media rights are the cornerstone of any successful collegiate athletic program. With previous generations' contractual obligations recently terminating, many collegiate programs and conferences are exploring new avenues to cast a wider net with their product. In this presentation, we will examine the Atlantic Coast Conference, the ACC, and the recent media rights deal to establish their own new subnetwork within ESPN, and how that has presented a new mold for future conferences to follow. So before we dive deep into the ACC, I think it should be very important for us to take a little bit of time to go over the Power 5 conferences, which are noted here, the SEC, ACC, Big 10, Big 12, and the Pac-12. Not necessarily to go into their schools, but more to understand better their current media rights deals. We'll start with the ACC, which is the most notable conference within the Power 5. They have deals set up with CBS, ESPN, and their own SEC network. In doing these calculations, we really don't take into factor their individual networks since they are subsidiaries of ESPN. So both their deals with CBS and ESPN come in just over $3 billion at $3.075 billion. And those contracts are set to expire in the 2025 season year. The ACC, which we will dive deeper in as this presentation goes along, has current media deals set up with ESPN and ABC. It is important to note that both ESPN and ABC are both subsidiaries of the Disney company, but since they are their own, both established independent networks, they are their own individual rights deals. They also have developed their own network within this past year, and their totals come out to $3.6 billion set to expire in the 2027 season year. The Big Ten has their deals set up with ESPN and Fox. They also established their own network. Previously, they were the first conference to set up their own network. Wasn't as successful since their current contracts had the marquee games featured on ESPN and Fox, with the Big Ten network simply getting the scraps. Not as much exposure for the rest of the country, so not as successful in the long run. Their contracts expire in the 2023 season year, and it comes out to $2.46 billion. The Big 12 have their rights also set up with ESPN and Fox. It's important to note that the Big 12 was the first major conference featured on ESPN Plus. That's ESPN's over-the-top streaming platform, which gained a lot of immediate exposure for the streaming community. Their contracts come in at $2.6 billion, and it's set to expire in the 2025 season year. And finally, the Pac-12 has their rights also set up with ESPN and Fox. There's no set sub-network. They're not as notably promoted on the ESPN Plus app, and their contracts come out to $1.5 billion set to expire at the 2024 season year. Now, outside of just signing media rights to networks like ESPN, CBS, and Fox, many conferences are looking to create their own sub-networks through ESPN for greater exposure. As we mentioned previously, the Big Ten was the original conference to set up this sub-network, and for the reasons stated before, had its said failures. What's also important to note is that major programs like the University of Texas have been able to set up their own network for their school, the Longhorn Network. With that, since the University of Texas is the largest university in the country with the largest donor base, they obviously found the resources to be able to establish their own network and give exposure to all their sports for all their fans across the country. But that leads us next to the SEC network, which was established a few years ago with ESPN, and what we're presenting now, the ACC network within ESPN. The development of these sub-networks allow for a greater exposure of conferences' other sports. While football reigns king in collegiate athletics, conferences like the ACC are just as notable for their schools' basketball and baseball programs. Additionally, these sub-networks allow for conferences to showcase their lower performing schools within those major sports seasons. For example, we are currently in the thick of collegiate football, and while Clemson is the top program within the ACC network allows exposure for teams like North Carolina State and Wake Forest to get just as good exposure on a major network. Now, there are some trends given to these different styles initially when you look at the SEC network and now the ACC network. So the first trend with the SEC network and even the Longhorn Network, which we said was for the University of Texas. These were primarily offered as independent channels that a cable provider can choose to add to their selection. So it wasn't necessarily mandatory for a cable provider to add on these new networks. Now, obviously, conferences like the SEC, which is the most notable conference within the FBS, has a lot of marquee schools that a provider would want to add on that network, right? Because you have a lot of these big name schools that people are going to want to watch. So the content can really only be consumed if you have that set cable provider uh, and has the available channel. Most providers added them on, warranting solid general exposure. So really, the only access to these networks were through the conventional cable system. Now, with the second trend and the development of the ACC network, they still have the option to be added on as a channel by a cable provider, but they have a much stronger presence on ESPN's over-the-top platform, ESPN Plus, and other streaming providers. The content can be consumed both through the cable provider and the OTT platform. Most cable providers didn't add on the AC network as an initial channel, but through ESPN, it had much larger reach down the line, in addition to major streaming platforms as well. So OTT, which stands for over the top programming, ultimately is what will be the big winner for the ACC network. Availability through cable networks is great, but market trends show that a vast majority of consumers are making the shift from cable to streaming. The ACC network wasn't even available for the majority of cable providers at the start of this season, but streaming providers like Hulu, YouTube TV, and Sling all had the channel baked into their subscription. Some will say that only time will tell if the transition to full streaming television consumption is the future, but many will argue, including myself, that the transition has already come into full effect. As more and more consumers switch to the streaming OTT model, cable providers will begin to cut access to these channels, and people ultimately will be the ones to suffer. And once they realize that they can watch their favorite teams through a new service at a fraction of the price as cable, that is when the ACC network will take the title and reign supreme over the SEC network and its competitive sub networks. I truly believe that the ACC was very strategic in signing this contract with ESPN of this sub network and allowing the rights of that network to be distributed through all of these different streaming and over the top platforms. I think time will tell that they will reign supreme. And as teams within the ACC continue to dominate, not only through collegiate football, but through all the other four major sports as well, I think you will see a huge spike in viewership through the ACC network, not only through cable providers, but more specifically through streaming services as well. So, with that being said, I would like to thank you for your time. Once again, my name is Anthony Barroso. And this has been a presentation on the ACC Network's media rights. Thanks so much.